The world had shrunk to the cellar. It was a damp, clinging kind of cold that seeped into your bones, no matter how many blankets Moody piled on us. Not the sharp, invigorating cold of a clear winter morning, but the stagnant chill of earth and stone, heavy with the scent of potato peelings and unwashed bodies. Each breath was a visible cloud, a tiny ghost escaping my lips, only to be swallowed by the musty air. I pressed my back against the rough, uneven brick wall, trying to siphon some warmth from the meager heat emanating from the tiny, sputtering candle perched precariously on an upturned crate. Its flame flickered, a nervous heartbeat in the oppressive gloom, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and shrank like grotesque giants on the low ceiling. My sister, Lotte, was curled into my side, a small, fragile bundle. Her breath was shallow and quick, a tiny puff against the worn wool of my threadbare coat. She was only 4, and the cellar had become her entire universe. She rarely spoke anymore, her bright blue eyes, once so full of mischief, now wide and watchful, reflecting the candle's weak glow like polished stones. I could feel the rhythmic thrum of her heart against my ribs, a faint, insistent beat that was both a comfort and a terrible, aching responsibility. Her small hand, sticky with the dried residue of the last piece of rye bread we'd shared hours ago, clutched the fabric of my trousers. The skin on her knuckles was chapped and rough, despite my efforts to keep her clean with the small, damp cloth Moody had left us. The silence, when it came, was never truly silent. It was a suffocating blanket woven from the distant rumble of the city, a low, guttural growl that was always there, an omnipresent threat. Sometimes it was punctuated by the sharp, cracking retort of distant rifle fire, like dry twigs snapping underfoot, or the hollow thud of artillery rounds impacting somewhere far away, shaking the very foundations of our temporary prison. Each tremor sent a fresh wave of dust sifting down from the ceiling, a fine, gritty powder that coated everything, our hair, our clothes, the rough blankets. It tasted like pulverized concrete and despair. My tongue felt permanently furred with it. My stomach ached, a hollow, gnawing emptiness that had become a familiar companion. It wasn't just hunger. It was a deeper, more profound sense of lack, an absence of warmth, of safety, of Moody's reassuring presence. Her scent, a mix of lavender and the faint sweetness of baking, was a ghost that haunted my memories, making the present desolation even more acute. She had gone out 2 days ago, just to see if the baker had anything, she'd said, her voice a little too bright, her eyes too wide. She'd left us with a half loaf of stale bread and a promise that felt as fragile and easily broken as the glass in the shattered window frames above us. I reached out a trembling hand and gently stroked Lotte's thin hair. It was matted and coarse, tangled with dust and neglect. She stirred slightly, whimpering, and burrowed deeper into my side. I remembered another time, not so long ago, when her hair had been soft and smelled of the lemon soap Moody used. We'd been in our apartment then, before the stairwell collapsed, before the endless days and nights in this cold, dark hole. The memory was a cruel shard of glass in my mind, glinting with a pain that was almost physical. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if the very walls were pressing in on us. A new sound began to filter through the earth above, a high-pitched wailing keen that rose and fell, rising again, louder, closer, the air raid siren. It was a sound that now lived inside my head, a constant shrill reminder of the monster outside, my muscles tensed, nodding involuntarily. Lotte whimpered again, her small body trembling against mine. I pulled her closer, burying her face into my coat, trying to shield her from the sound, from the terror that gripped my own heart. The vibrations intensified, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the floor, through my bones, through the very earth itself. It was the sound of the approaching bombers, a swarm of metal bees, their venom waiting to fall. The temperature in the cellar seemed to drop further, a sudden, sharp cold born of dread. I could feel the clammy sweat on my palms even as my teeth began to chatter. The candle flame danced wildly, throwing our distorted shadows against the wall. I closed my eyes, trying to conjure Moody's face, her smile, the warmth of her hand in mine. But all I saw was the darkness behind my eyelids, the endless, suffocating darkness, and felt the trembling of Lotte's small body and the cold, unyielding brick against my back. The world outside roared, a symphony of destruction, and we were just two small, trapped creatures waiting for the monster to pass, or to find us. Chapter 2. The roaring crescendo of the bombs lasted an eternity, or perhaps only a few minutes. Time had become as fluid and meaningless as the trickle of water that sometimes seeped through a crack in the cellar wall. Each explosion was a physical blow, a concussive force that slammed into us, shaking the very earth. Fine dust, smelling of burnt plaster and something metallic and acrid, rained down on us in clouds, making us cough until our throats were raw. Lotte was a tight ball against me, her small hands clamped over her ears, though it was a futile gesture against the sheer volume of the world ending around us. I kept my own arms wrapped around her, a meager shield, my body rigid, braced for the next impact, and the one after that. My mouth was dry, tasting of dust and the bitter tang of fear. When the last deafening reverberation faded, leaving behind a ringing silence in my ears that was almost as loud as the explosions, the true quiet was terrifying. It wasn't the blessed peace of stillness, but the hollow vacuum after a scream, pregnant with the expectation of what might come next. The candle, miraculously, still flickered, its tiny flame a fragile beacon in the dust-choked air. It seemed to pulse with our own ragged breathing. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of smoke and pulverized earth, a scent that clung to my clothes and hair, a permanent reminder of the terror. The cold in the cellar now felt sharper, as if the bombing had somehow sucked the last vestiges of warmth from the very stones. Lotte slowly uncurled, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She didn't cry out, just looked at me with an unspoken question, a silent plea for reassurance that I couldn't give. My throat was too tight to speak. I just hugged her tighter, burying my face in her hair, feeling the delicate bones of her skull beneath my palm. Her skin was still clammy with fear, but her trembling had lessened. After a long moment, a new sound began to filter down to us, muted but persistent. A low, groaning creak from somewhere above, as if the building itself was sighing in agony. Then, a softer, trickling sound. Water, or something else. I strained my ears, trying to decipher the noises from the rubble above. The candle cast our shadows, long and distorted, against the cracked brick wall. The chill in the air seemed to deepen, a damp, oppressive cold that made my teeth ache. I pulled the thin blanket tighter around Lotte, feeling the scratchy wool against my cheek. "I need to look," I whispered, the words rasping in my dry throat. Lotte whimpered, clutching my sleeve. "No, stay," she pleaded, her voice a thin, reedy sound, barely audible. Just to see," I promised, though the word tasted like ash. "For food, for Mutti." The lie tasted even worse. Mutti wouldn't be there. I knew it deep down, a cold, hard knot in my stomach. But the idea of finding food was a powerful motivator. The ache in my gut was a constant, insistent reminder. Carefully, slowly, I disentangled myself from Lotte, the small warmth of her body leaving me instantly colder. I took the candle, shielding its flame with my cupped hand. The wick was short, the wax nearly gone. We wouldn't have light for much longer. The shadows danced more wildly now as I moved, making the familiar cellar corners seem alien and menacing. The air was thick and gritty. Each breath scraped in my lungs. I could feel the grit between my teeth. I crept towards the makeshift door, a splintered plank of wood leaning against the opening that led to the steps. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. The wood felt rough and cool under my fingertips. I pushed it aside, just enough to peek through the crack. Above, through the gaps in the collapsed stairwell, I could see nothing. Only more rubble, and a faint gray light, not the harsh daylight of the surface, but a muted, dusty illumination that suggested a world turned inside out. The smell of smoke was stronger here, biting at my nostrils, making my eyes water. A low, distant groan reached my ears again, closer this time. It was human, a faint, almost animal sound of pain. My breath hitched, fear and a morbid curiosity battled within me. I wanted to retreat, to pull the plank back, to disappear into the relative safety of the dark cellar, but the hunger and the phantom scent of Mutti pulled me forward. "Stay here, Lotte," I whispered, turning back to her. Her eyes were fixed on me, wide and glistening. "Don't move, don't make a sound." She nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Steeling myself, I squeezed through the narrow opening, leaving the candle and Lotte behind. The cold that met me on the other side was astonishing. Not the damp cellar chill, but the sharp penetrating cold of exposed winter air, made worse by the gaping holes in what was once a building. My fingers, numb from the cellar's dampness, prickled with the sudden intense chill. Each step upward was perilous, over splintered wood, twisted metal, and mountains of pulverized brick. The rubble shifted beneath my worn boots, sending showers of dust and grit cascading down. The air was still thick with the acrid smell of fire, mixed with the faint metallic tang of blood. The ruined structure above creaked and groaned around me, a symphony of decay, threatening to collapse further at any moment. I could feel the tremors of my own movements, amplifying the instability of the debris. My hands, rough and chapped, instinctively reached out to steady myself on sharp edges and crumbling surfaces. I climbed slowly, painstakingly, towards that faint gray light, towards the unknown. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my chest, beating against my ribs, convinced that at any moment the monster would reach out and seize me. I had to find food. I had to find something. For Lotte. For us. Chapter 3. The ascent was a slow, agonizing crawl through a labyrinth of destruction. Each precarious step over the rubble felt like an act of betrayal against the fragile safety of the cellar. The gray light grew stronger with every upward struggle, painting the chaos in muted, desolate tones. It wasn't the welcoming, vibrant light of a new day, but the sterile, revealing glow of a wound. The air grew colder, biting at my exposed skin, making my ears ache and my nose run. The omnipresent smell of smoke intensified, thick and suffocating, clinging to the back of my throat like a bitter memory. Mixed with it was a new, horrifying odor. The cloying sweetness of decay, subtle at first, then growing stronger, more undeniable. My stomach clenched, not just from hunger now, but from a profound nausea. I finally pulled myself up onto what had once been the ground floor. Now, a treacherous landscape of shattered plaster, splintered furniture, and gaping holes where walls used to be. The cold wind howled through the skeletal remains of the building, carrying with it a fine, gritty spray of dust and debris that stung my eyes. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, tasting the dry mineral grit on my tongue. The sounds were different up here too, not the distant rumble of earlier, but the closer, sharper sounds of the city's slow death. The creak of collapsing timbers, the distant clang of metal, the whisper of the wind through broken windows, sounding like 1,000 ghostly sighs. My eyes slowly adjusted to the brighter, yet still dim, light. The street, or what was left of it, lay exposed through a massive breach in the building's facade. It was a scene ripped from a nightmare. Our street, once lined with proud, tall buildings, buzzing with the everyday sounds of life, the clatter of horse-drawn carts, children's laughter, Frau Schmidt yelling from her bakery, was now a desolate canyon of ruin. Buildings stood like hollowed-out teeth, their inner workings exposed to the sky. Rubble choked the pavement, creating mountains and valleys where cobbled streets used to be. Twisted tram lines lay like dead snakes across the debris. The biting cold wind whipped around me, carrying the stench of smoke and decay even more strongly now. I shivered, pulling my thin coat tighter around my small frame, but it offered little protection. The cold seemed to penetrate straight to my bones. My hands, still raw and chapped, felt stiff and numb. I saw shapes in the wreckage, indistinguishable forms half buried under stone and wood. I didn't want to look closer. I couldn't. My gaze fell upon a shattered window frame from what had been Frau Weber's apartment, now precariously dangling above a gaping hole. Below it, half buried under a heap of bricks, was something bright yellow. A tin. My heart gave a painful lurch. Could it be? Food? Ration tins sometimes were surprisingly resilient. Hope, a fragile, dangerous thing, flickered within me. Carefully, I began to pick my way towards it, my worn boots crunching on glass shards and loose masonry. Each step was a deliberate act, my senses heightened, wary of every shifting piece of debris, every creak and groan of the dying building. The air grew heavier with the combined smells of damp earth, stagnant water from burst pipes, and that pervasive, sickening sweetness. The cold was a constant, unwelcome presence, seeping through the thin soles of my shoes. My fingers ached with the effort of balancing, often scraping against rough surfaces. As I drew closer to the yellow tin, my eyes caught sight of something else, something much larger, half buried under a fallen beam and a drift of plaster. It was a hand, a human hand, unnaturally pale, protruding from the debris. It was still, eerily so, even as the wind stirred the dust around it. A wave of icy dread washed over me, colder than the wind, colder than the cellar. My breath caught in my throat, a choked gasp. The faint, distant groan I'd heard earlier came back to me, echoing in my mind. My legs felt like lead, suddenly unwilling to move. My stomach churned, and a wave of dizziness washed over me. I wanted to turn away, to run back to Lotte, to the dark, if damp, safety of the cellar. But the yellow tin, a beacon of desperate hope, was so close, and the image of Lotte's thin, hungry face burned in my mind. I forced myself to take another step, then another, my eyes darting nervously between the hand and the tin. The silence here, above ground, was punctuated by the occasional distant crack of a rifle, a sharp, flat sound that cut through the desolation, reminding me that the monster was still out there, actively hunting. The very air seemed to vibrate with unseen threats. Finally, I reached the spot. The yellow tin was indeed a ration tin, slightly dented but seemingly intact. My fingers, trembling with a mix of cold and adrenaline, reached for it. The metal was surprisingly cool against my skin. Just as my fingertips brushed its surface, a soft, almost imperceptible sound reached my ears. A faint scratch from beneath the fallen beam. My heart leaped into my throat. I froze, every muscle in my body tightening. The grotesque hand I had seen earlier. Was it moving? My eyes darted to it. No, it was still. But the sound. Then, a faint muffled whimper. It came from deeper under the beam, very close to where the hand protruded. It was the sound of a child, not Lotte, someone else. A wave of conflicting emotions flooded me. Terror, curiosity, and a strange, unexpected pang of something akin to pity. The smell of decay was overpowering now, battling with the sharp metallic tang of cold iron from a twisted pipe nearby. I stood there, frozen, the yellow ration tin almost within my grasp, but my eyes fixed on the rubble, listening intently. The whimper came again, a little stronger this time, unmistakably human, unmistakably young. The cold wind continued to gust, chilling me to the core, but a new internal tremor began, a tremor not of cold, but of a decision hanging in the desolate air. To take the tin and flee, or to investigate the source of that small, desperate sound. The rough edges of the broken bricks around me felt sharp and unforgiving. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, heavy as the fallen concrete. Chapter 4. The whimper was a tiny thread, almost lost in the vast tapestry of the city's dying breaths, yet it snagged me. It was too small, too fragile to ignore. The yellow ration tin, so close, felt suddenly insignificant, its promise of warmth and temporary relief overridden by the insistent, desperate sound. My fingers, still hovering over the cold metal, twitched with indecision. The conflicting smells of smoke, decay, and damp earth swirled around me, pressing in. The cold, wind-whipped air raised goosebumps on my arms, but it was an internal chill that truly seized me. I pulled my hand back from the tin. Lotte's face, thin and pale, flashed in my mind. She was waiting for me. But the whimper. It was a child. Another child. How could I leave? Taking a deep, shaky breath that did little to calm my racing heart, I dropped to my knees, carefully navigating the jagged debris. Each movement sent a fresh cloud of plaster dust into the air, irritating my already raw throat. The smell of decay became sharper, almost unbearable, as I got closer to the source of the sound. It was coming from a pocket beneath a massive splintered wooden beam, which had fallen across a pile of concrete slabs and twisted rebar. A small, dark void, barely visible. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely a croak, raw from the dust and the dryness. My own breath plumed in the frigid air. The silence that followed was so profound, it seemed to suck all other sounds from the world. Only the distant, mournful creak of the ruined buildings and the ceaseless sigh of the wind remained. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Then, a faint rustle, and the whimper again, a little stronger, more hopeful. "Are you there?" I asked, a little louder this time, trying to inject some reassurance into my trembling voice. My fingers, still chapped and stiff from the cold, tentatively reached out, feeling the rough, cold concrete and splintered wood. A tiny, dusty face, streaked with grime and tears, slowly emerged from the shadows beneath the beam. It was a girl, no older than Lotte, perhaps even younger. Her eyes, wide and terrified, were a startling shade of green against the gray of her skin. Her hair was a tangled mess, caked with dirt. She was clutching a grimy, headless doll to her chest. Her small, thin lips trembled, but no sound came out. She just stared at me, like a trapped animal. The small pocket of air she was in was cold and smelled strongly of stagnant dampness and a metallic tang I now associated with recent destruction. "Are you hurt?" I asked, my voice softer now, feeling a strange mixture of fear and empathy. My own fear for Lotte momentarily receded, replaced by this immediate, tangible distress in front of me. The cold concrete pressed against my knees, digging in. She shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Her eyes, however, were fixed on something beneath her, or behind her. I followed her gaze into the dark recess. There, partially obscured by rubble, was a hand. A woman's hand, unnaturally still, pale and waxy, its fingers curled inwards. A ring, thin and gold, gleamed dully on one of them. The smell of decay intensified, making my stomach revolt. This was where the sickly sweetness was coming from. The little girl saw me looking, and a fresh wave of silent tears tracked clean paths down her dirty cheeks. She didn't make a sound, but her small shoulders began to shake with silent sobs. She was trapped, literally, between a beam and a lifeless body, held captive by the weight of the collapsed building. The chill of the ruined street seemed to intensify around us, a physical manifestation of the tragedy. I had to get her out. My mind, usually clouded with hunger and fear, now cleared with a sudden, sharp purpose. I couldn't leave her here, not like this. I began to assess the situation. The beam was too heavy for me to lift. It rested on several smaller pieces of debris, forming a precarious arch. If I removed the wrong piece, the whole thing could collapse, crushing her. My hands, calloused from scavenging and clutching, instinctively felt the texture of the rubble, trying to discern stability from fragility. The cold metal of a bent pipe nearby looked like it could be useful, perhaps as a lever. "Can you move?" I asked the girl, keeping my voice low and steady. "Just a little." "Try to crawl forward." She tried, pushing with her feet, but her small body was jammed. Her eyes flickered with renewed terror. The space was too tight, and there was something else. The small, sharp piece of wood or metal digging into her leg, I couldn't tell. I looked around frantically, my gaze sweeping the desolate landscape of our former street. The cold wind howled, rattling loose debris, and the sounds of the dying city seemed to mock my helplessness. My hands, still numb from the cold, felt clumsy and inadequate. I could feel the grit and sharp edges of the broken bricks everywhere. The overwhelming smell of dust and destruction filled my nostrils, making me cough. My eyes fell back on the yellow ration tin, still sitting there, a small splash of color in the monochrome desolation. It suddenly seemed utterly trivial. The cold gnawed at me, the hunger a dull ache in my belly, but the desperate green eyes of the little girl, trapped and grieving, eclipsed everything else. I had to try. I had to. For Lotte, for this girl, for the fading remnants of something human within me. Chapter 5. The cold reality of her entrapment settled over me like a shroud. The beam, thick and unforgiving, was too heavy for my 10-year-old strength. My hands, though toughened by a year of scraping and hauling, felt useless. I crouched there, peering into the dark, confined space where the little girl lay, her small frame pressed against the cold, unmoving bulk of her mother. The smell of decay was now so potent, it coated the inside of my mouth, metallic and sweet and sickening. My stomach roiled, but I forced it down. "What's your name?" I whispered, my voice rough. It felt important somehow to give her a name in this place of nameless horrors. "Elsa," she breathed, the word barely audible, a fragile wisp of sound in the howling wind. Her voice was thin, like Lotte's when she was scared. "Elsa," I repeated, letting the name settle between us. My name is Karl. I began to poke and prod at the smaller pieces of debris around the beam, using my chapped, stiff fingers, testing their stability. Each movement was deliberate, slow, agonizingly careful. The rubble was a treacherous puzzle. There was a shard of metal, twisted and rusty, that looked like it might serve as a lever. It was sharp-edged, biting into my cold fingertips as I gripped it, but I barely registered the pain. My focus was entirely on the precarious balance of stone and wood. The air here was strangely still, trapped beneath the larger fragments, a small, cold pocket. The wind, meanwhile, seemed to pick up, whining through the skeletal remains of the buildings, carrying with it the ever-present grit and the distant sporadic sounds of rifle fire. Each crack made me flinch, my muscles tensing involuntarily. The cold was profound, seeping through the thin fabric of my trousers, making my knees ache on the unforgiving concrete. My breath plumed out in ragged white clouds, each exhale a visible measure of my effort. I found a relatively stable piece of concrete slab, about the size of my head, and began to carefully wedge the rusty metal shard beneath the heavy beam, aiming to create a small fulcrum. The metal scraped against the stone with a high-pitched shriek that made Elsa flinch. My hands, clumsy with cold, fumbled with the makeshift lever. The effort strained every muscle in my small body. My arms trembled, and my breath hitched in my chest. The metal was frigid against my skin. "Can you push, Elsa?" I grunted, my voice tight with exertion. "Just a little, if I can lift it a tiny bit." Elsa nodded, her green eyes wide and fixed on my face, a desperate hope dawning in them. She shifted, trying to get some purchase with her small, dirty feet. I leaned into the metal shard, using all my weight, gritting my teeth. A low groan came from the beam, a deep, resonant sound of stress. Dust rained down in a heavy curtain. For a terrifying moment, the whole structure seemed to shift, sending my heart leaping into my throat. I froze, holding my breath, waiting. The groaning subsided. "Now," I whispered, straining, my face red with effort. Elsa pushed. With a superhuman effort born of terror and hope, she managed to slide herself forward a few inches. Her little legs scraped against the rough concrete, but she made progress. My arms burned, and the rusty metal dug deeper into my palm, drawing a thin line of blood. But I held it. "Again!" I urged, pushing harder, sweat beading on my forehead despite the freezing air. Slowly, agonizingly, inch by painful inch, Elsa crawled out from under the beam. Her clothes were torn, her hair a tangled mess, and her small face was a mask of fear and exhaustion. The air seemed to taste of grit and the iron tang of fresh blood from my hand. The cold, damp earth against my knees was a constant reminder of the desolation around us. Finally, with a soft cry, she was free. She collapsed onto the rubble beside me, shivering uncontrollably, clutching her headless doll. Her green eyes, brimming with tears, looked at me with a profound, unspoken gratitude that twisted something inside me. The sweet, cloying smell of decay from her mother's body, now fully exposed, made me gag. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her close, trying to transfer some of my own meager body heat. Her small body was shockingly cold, like a stone left out in the winter. Her breath was shallow and ragged against my neck. I could feel the sharp edges of her small bones through her thin clothing. The cold wind continued to gust, chilling me to the core, but a new internal tremor began, a tremor not of cold, but of a decision hanging in the desolate air. The gritty texture of the shattered world beneath our knees was a constant, stark reminder of our precarious existence. I looked at the yellow ration tin, still sitting there, a small splash of color in the monochrome desolation. It suddenly seemed utterly trivial. The cold gnawed at me, the hunger a dull ache in my belly, but the desperate green eyes of the little girl, trapped and grieving, eclipsed everything else. I had to try. I had to. For Lotte, for this girl, for the fading remnants of something human within me. Chapter 6. Elsa was a shivering, silent presence by my side, her small hand clutching mine with surprising strength. Her skin was icy to the touch, and I could feel the tremors running through her small frame, despite my attempt to share my meager warmth. The cold, relentless wind whipped around us, carrying a fresh deluge of fine grit and the ever-present stench of smoke and decay. It bit at my exposed ears and nose, making them ache, and seemed to siphon away any warmth I tried to generate. My own hand, where the rusty metal had cut me, throbbed with a dull ache, the fresh blood a startling dark crimson against the gray dust that coated everything. The metallic tang of it was faintly present in the air. The ration tin. It was still there, a small, defiant splash of color in the monochrome landscape of ruin. I reached for it, my fingers stiff with cold, and finally, my numb fingertips closed around its cold, smooth surface. It was dented, but intact. A small, miraculous reprieve. The metallic smell of the tin mixed with the pervasive smoke and damp earth. "This is food," I told Elsa, holding it up. My voice was a little steadier now, buoyed by the small victory. She just nodded, her wide green eyes fixed on the tin, a flicker of something almost like hope in their depths. Her small stomach rumbled, a faint, almost inaudible sound. But opening it was another challenge. My fingers were clumsy, half frozen. I tried to pry at the lid, scraping my nails against the cold metal, but it wouldn't budge. I needed something sharp. My gaze swept the surrounding rubble again, searching. The silence, punctuated by the distant sporadic sounds of the dying city. A faint, mournful groan of collapsing timber, the sharp, flat crack of a rifle, pressed in on us. The air was thick with suspended dust, making each breath a gritty experience. A glint caught my eye. Half buried under a splintered door frame, I saw the handle of a rusty kitchen knife. It looked dull, but it might work. With Elsa still clinging to my side, I carefully picked my way over to it, the rough, uneven surfaces of the bricks and broken plaster digging into the thin soles of my boots. The cold seeped into my feet, making them feel like heavy lumps of ice. I retrieved the knife. Its handle was cold and rough, coated in a fine layer of rust and grime. The blade, though dull, felt substantial in my hand. Carefully, I worked the tip of the knife under the rim of the ration tin. It was slow, painstaking work. Each scrape of metal against metal sent a jarring reverberation up my arm. My fingers, still aching from the earlier cut, were clumsy, but I persevered. The biting cold wind seemed to magnify the effort, chilling my exposed skin even more. Finally, with a soft pop, the lid yielded. The smell that wafted out was unexpected. Not the hearty smell of meat or vegetables, but a faint sugary aroma. Peaches, tinned peaches in syrup, a luxury I hadn't seen in months, perhaps even a year. The scent was a sudden jarring memory of another life, a life of warmth and food and safety. It brought with it a fresh wave of longing, a sharp, bitter pang in my chest. Elsa, sensing the change, leaned closer, her nose twitching. Her eyes widened even further at the sight of the pale, syrupy fruit. "Peaches," I whispered, the word tasting foreign and wonderful on my tongue. "For Lotte, for us, and now, for Elsa." I pulled out the knife and with careful precision began to cut the soft, slippery peaches into small, manageable pieces. My hands were still shaking, but with a different kind of tremor now, a tremor of relief and a strange, fragile joy. I offered the first piece to Elsa. She took it with both hands, her small fingers sticky with syrup, and brought it to her mouth slowly, as if not quite believing it was real. Her eyes closed as she ate it, a tiny sound of pure pleasure escaping her lips. The cold air around us seemed to momentarily soften. I watched her, a knot of emotion in my throat. She was so small, so utterly vulnerable. My own hunger was still a dull throb, but seeing her eat, seeing that flicker of something akin to happiness in her eyes, filled a different kind of void. "We have to go back to Lotte," I said, my voice quiet. "She's waiting. She's hungry too." Elsa nodded, still chewing slowly, savoring each mouthful. The sweetness of the peaches was a stark contrast to the bitter taste of dust and fear that usually filled my mouth. I ate a piece myself. The soft, sweet fruit was a shock to my system, a burst of flavor that momentarily drowned out the persistent taste of ash. The syrup, cold and thick, slid down my throat, a rare, soothing sensation. With the tin clutched firmly in my hand and Elsa's cold hand in mine, we began the slow, cautious descent back into the relative darkness of the cellar. The sun, a weak, pale disk, was beginning its descent behind the jagged teeth of the ruined buildings, casting long, mournful shadows across the rubble-strewn street. The air grew colder and the wind bit harder. The distant rumble of the city seemed to deepen, a low, constant threat. Each step on the shifting debris was a reminder of the fragility of our existence. But now, a fragile hope flickered within me, warmed by the unlikely gift of tinned peaches and the presence of another small, cold hand in mine. The rough, uneven surfaces beneath my worn boots felt less threatening now, imbued with a sense of purpose. We were not alone. Chapter 7. The return journey to the cellar was a blur of heightened senses and desperate urgency. Each step, burdened by the small sack of potatoes, felt heavier than the last. The cold wind bit at my face, making my eyes water, blurring the already treacherous path through the rubble. The smell of dust and smoke was still thick in the air, but now the earthy, familiar scent of the potatoes clinging to the sack was a small, comforting presence. My stomach, though still aching with hunger, felt a flicker of anticipation. My hands, rough and chapped, gripped the sack tightly, the cold, gritty skin of the potatoes a tangible promise. I squeezed back through the narrow opening into the cellar, greeted by a darkness that felt even more profound after the pale, desolate light of the street. The air in here was still, heavy with the damp, earthy smell of the underground and a faint, sweet ghost of peach from yesterday. My eyes strained, trying to pierce the gloom. "Lotte, Elsa," I whispered, my voice hoarse. A rustle, then Lotte's thin voice, "Karl, you're back." Relief, fragile but potent, permeated her tone. Elsa stirred too, a soft sigh escaping her lips. I moved towards them, guided by their faint sounds. I could feel their small, cold bodies before I reached them, huddled together under the blankets. The cold in the cellar was as relentless as ever, seeping into my bones, making my teeth chatter. I sank down beside them, the cold, rough concrete chilling my knees, and immediately felt the warmth of their combined bodies, however meager, a small comfort against the pervasive chill. "Look what I found," I whispered, holding out the sack. The potatoes felt hard and cold in the thin cloth. Lotte's small hands reached out, brushing against the rough surface of the sack, her fingers closing around one of the potatoes. "Potatoes?" she breathed, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. Elsa, too, reached out, her green eyes, even in the near darkness, wide with a nascent hope. Raw potatoes, cold and hard, were not a feast, but they were food. We ate them slowly, meticulously, our teeth scraping against the cold, unyielding flesh. They tasted of earth and raw starch, a bitter contrast to the sweet peaches, but they were filling. Each mouthful was a conscious effort, a fight against the emptiness. The cold, unwashed skin of the potatoes felt rough against my tongue. The gritty texture of the outside mixed with the bland, dense interior. As we chewed, the only sounds were our soft, deliberate movements, punctuated by the distant, muffled rumble of the city above, a low, constant growl that never truly faded. The cold seeped into our mouths with each bite, making our jaws ache. My cut hand throbbed, a dull, persistent beat. After we had eaten a few each, enough to dull the sharp edge of hunger, I carefully retied the sack. We needed to make them last. The darkness pressed in on us again, absolute and heavy. Lotte and Elsa nestled closer, their small, cold bodies seeking warmth. I wrapped my arms around them both, trying to provide what little heat I could. I could feel the rhythmic thrum of their hearts, fragile beats against the backdrop of the city's dying pulse. The familiar, musty smell of the cellar filled my nostrils. "Tell me a story, Karl," Lotte whispered, her voice barely audible in the dark. It was an old request, a routine from a time before, when Moody would tuck us into bed, and I would invent tales of brave knights in magical forests. The memory was a sharp, poignant ache in my chest. I closed my eyes, trying to conjure an image of something other than ruin and darkness. But my mind was filled with the gray light of the shattered street, the menacing shadows of the soldiers, the still hand of Elsa's mother. The monster. It was always there, lurking. "Once," I began, my voice a low, rough murmur, "there was a boy and his sister, and they lived in a very deep cave. And the cave was cold, but they had each other." The story felt thin, inadequate, stripped bare by the brutal reality of our lives. There were no knights, no magic, just the cold, the hunger, and the enduring presence of each other. "And a girl came to the cave," Elsa added softly, her small voice barely a whisper, echoing my words. And she was cold too. Yes, I affirmed, pulling them tighter, and they shared what little they had, and they were safe, in the cave, from the monster outside. The words were a balm, a fragile shield against the encroaching despair. It was not a story of heroics, but of survival, of small acts of kindness in a world that had forgotten such things. The cold continued to press in, the dampness clung to our clothes, and the distant rumble of the war was a constant, unsettling reminder. But for a few moments, huddled together in the absolute darkness, sharing the meager warmth of our bodies and the bitter taste of raw potatoes, we were safe. We were together. And that, in this monstrous, dying city, was everything. The rough brick against my back was still there, but now it felt less like a prison and more like a shelter. Chapter 8. The night was a long, cold crawl, punctuated by the fitful, shallow breaths of Lotte and Elsa beside me. I didn't sleep, not truly. Every creak from above, every distant thump, every sigh of the wind through the rubble kept my senses on edge. The cold was a living entity, a pervasive, insidious force that seeped into every fiber of my being, making my teeth chatter uncontrollably even when I tried to clench my jaw shut. My limbs ached with a dull, persistent pain, and my stomach resumed its familiar, hollow gnawing. The taste of peach, so sweet and briefly comforting, was long gone, replaced by the persistent dryness of my mouth and the metallic tang of fear. Lotte stirred first, a small whimper escaping her lips. Her body was rigid with cold. Elsa, still nestled between us, also shifted, pressing closer, her small hand reaching out instinctively for reassurance. The darkness was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on us. It smelled of damp earth, stale air, and the lingering faint sweetness of yesterday's peaches, now a mocking memory. The rough, uneven texture of the brick wall against my back felt even colder than before. "Are you awake?" I whispered, my voice rough from disuse. "Yes," Lotte murmured, her voice thin and small. "I'm cold, Karl." "I know," I replied, pulling the threadbare blanket tighter, though it offered little real warmth. My cut hand throbbed faintly, a dull reminder of the risks taken. The first hint of dawn was not light, but a subtle change in the air, a faint, almost imperceptible lessening of the crushing darkness. Then, a sliver of pale, watery gray began to filter through the crack above, slowly, reluctantly, pushing back the shadows. It revealed our small, huddled forms, dusty and disheveled, our faces drawn and pale. Lotte's eyes were still wide and watchful, but Elsa's seemed even more haunted than before, reflecting the weak light with an unsettling stillness. The silence of the early morning was fragile, occasionally broken by the distant familiar growl of the city, a low rumble that always felt like a premonition. The cold was still profound, making my breath plume out in visible clouds with every exhale. My muscles felt stiff and unwilling to move. The musty scent of the cellar was now a constant, almost physical presence. "We need more food," I said, the words heavy with a dreadful certainty. The last peach, a small, sticky memory, was all that remained from yesterday. Lotte's stomach rumbled, a faint, pathetic sound. Elsa simply looked at me, her green eyes filled with a silent, pleading hunger. The thought of going back out, back into the world of shattered buildings and unseen dangers, filled me with a fresh wave of dread. But there was no choice. For them, the weight of their small, fragile lives pressed down on me, heavy and relentless. My hands, still feeling the lingering stiffness from the cold, instinctively tightened. "Stay here," I instructed them, my voice firmer than I felt. "Don't move from this spot. I'll be back as quickly as I can." Lotte nodded, her face etched with resignation. Elsa, too, gave a tiny nod, her gaze unwavering. I rose slowly, my joints stiff, feeling the dull ache in my knees from the cold concrete. The small warmth of their bodies left me instantly colder. I moved towards the cellar opening, the sound of my worn boots crunching faintly on the scattered grit and debris. Each step felt heavy, burdened with the invisible weight of responsibility. The cold air grew sharper as I approached the opening, carrying the biting scent of smoke and frost. Pushing aside the splintered plank, I emerged into the desolate street again. The gray light of morning illuminated a scene of even greater devastation than yesterday. More buildings had succumbed overnight, their skeletal remains twisted and broken. The wind, colder and more biting than before, whistled through the gaps, raising plumes of dust and grit that stung my eyes. The smell of smoke was acrid, mixed with the unsettling sweetness of decay, now more pronounced in the morning air. My eyes swept the street, searching for any sign of hope, any discarded scrap. The yellow ration tin had been a miracle. I couldn't expect another. The cold seeped through the thin soles of my boots, making my feet ache. My hands, rough and chapped, felt brittle in the cold. I started to move, slowly, carefully, picking my way through the labyrinth of rubble. Every overturned cart, every half-collapsed doorway, every heap of bricks was a potential hiding place for something edible. My eyes scanned every crevice, every shadow. The street was utterly silent save for the wind and the distant constant hum of the war. There were no other people, no sounds of life, just the evidence of its swift, brutal cessation. The silence was heavy, oppressive, broken only by the crunch of my own boots on the debris. The constant sense of being watched, of being exposed, prickled at the back of my neck. I felt like a small, insignificant mouse scurrying through the ruins of a giant's playground, constantly aware of the unseen predators that might be lurking. The cold wind bit at my face, making my eyes water and my skin feel raw. My stomach growled, a hollow, empty sound in the stillness. I spotted a discarded sack, half buried under a pile of bricks near what used to be a bakery. My heart gave a hopeful lurch. Could it be? Flour? A few forgotten potatoes? Even stale bread would be a feast. My breath hitched in my throat. I began to pick my way towards it, my pace quickening slightly, heedless of the shifting rubble. The sharp edges of broken masonry scraped against my trousers as I squeezed past a jagged wall. As I neared the sack, a sudden, sharp sound cut through the silence. Not a distant rifle shot, but something closer, more metallic, a clatter from inside the bakery. My blood ran cold. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate beat. The cold air seemed to crystallize around me. The smell of dust and burnt sugar, a ghost of the bakery's past, seemed to thicken. I slowly, carefully, crouched down behind a fallen concrete pillar, my eyes fixed on the gaping, dark maw of the bakery entrance. The sack, so close, was now forgotten. My body was rigid, my hands clenched into fists, the fingernails digging into my palms, the cold, raw concrete pressed against my cheek. I held my breath, listening. The sounds of the dying city seemed to fade, replaced by the frantic beating of my own heart in my ears. The monster was here, in the bakery, and I was alone. Chapter 9. The air in the street seemed to thicken, suddenly heavy with a palpable tension. My breath hitched in my throat, each inhale a shallow, painful gasp. The clatter from inside the bakery echoed in my ears, sharp and metallic, utterly out of place in the desolate silence. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the cold, raw concrete pillar I was hiding behind. The icy chill of the stone seeped into my cheek, but I barely registered it. Every nerve ending was screaming, primed for danger. My eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on the black maw of the bakery entrance. It was a gaping wound in the side of the building, framed by splintered wood and chunks of broken plaster. The smell of burnt sugar, a ghost of happier times, mingled with the acrid scent of smoke and the ubiquitous damp earth. But beneath it all, I could now detect a faint, unfamiliar smell. Something metallic, something sharp, something human. Then, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness within the bakery. It moved slowly, cautiously, silhouetted against the faint, dusty light filtering in from the street. Not one shadow, but two. Two figures. Adult figures. My blood ran cold, a wave of icy dread washing over me. Soldiers, or worse, looters. The monster had many faces. They emerged fully into the gray morning light. Two men, their uniforms dark and grimy, indistinct in the gloom, but their rifles were unmistakable, long and deadly, clutched in their hands. They spoke in low, guttural tones, a language I didn't fully understand, but the harshness of their voices needed no translation. They were not our soldiers. The realization sent a fresh wave of panic through me, so intense it made my hands tremble uncontrollably. One of them was carrying a sack, not the one I had seen, but a larger, bulging one, confirming my worst fears. They were scavenging, just like me, but with the power of their weapons. They scanned the street with cold, assessing eyes, their gazes sweeping over my hiding place, lingering for a terrifying moment before moving on. I pressed myself tighter against the rough concrete, trying to make myself invisible, scarcely daring to breathe. The gritty texture of the stone against my cheek felt like 1,000 tiny needles. Their boots crunched on the broken glass and debris as they moved, the sound amplified in the stillness. It felt impossibly loud, like thunder in my ears. I could feel the vibrations of their steps through the ground, through the pillar, through my very bones. The cold wind continued to howl, stirring the dust around them, making their figures seem even more menacing. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, picturing Lotte and Elsa huddled in the damp cold of the cellar, their small faces pale with hunger. The image burned away my fear, replacing it with a desperate, fierce resolve. I had to find something. For them. I couldn't go back empty-handed. When I opened my eyes again, the men were moving away, down the street, their forms receding into the hazy distance, swallowed by the ruins. The crunch of their boots slowly faded, replaced by the persistent sigh of the wind and the mournful creak of dying buildings. A profound wave of relief washed over me, so potent it left me weak, my muscles trembling uncontrollably. I leaned my head against the cold concrete, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The metallic tang in the air seemed to lessen, replaced by the simple smell of dust and cold. After a long moment, when the silence had settled back into its oppressive normalcy, I forced myself to move. My limbs felt heavy, uncooperative. The sack I had spotted earlier was still there, untouched by the soldiers, half buried under the bricks. It was a small, tattered thing, far less promising than the one the men had carried, but it was something. I crawled towards it, my hands and knees scraping against the rough, unforgiving debris. The cold was still biting, but a new, almost feverish energy now propelled me. My hands, rough and chapped, reached for the sack, their tips numb with cold. It was heavier than I expected, filled with something lumpy. I pulled it free, dislodging a cascade of bricks and dust. The sack smelled strongly of potatoes and dirt. My heart leapt. Potatoes, not a feast, not the sweet, fleeting luxury of peaches, but sustenance, solid, filling. They were small, gritty, and probably half frozen, but they were food. A small, desperate victory snatched from the jaws of despair. I felt the rough, cold skin of the potatoes through the thin fabric of the sack, a promise of warmth and life. As I held the sack, the familiar, distant rumble of the city deepened, a low, guttural growl that resonated through the ground. The wind picked up, howling mournfully, and a fresh flurry of dust and debris swirled around me. The gray sky above seemed to press down, heavy and foreboding. The monster was still out there, always out there, but for now, for this brief stolen moment, I had found a way to fight it. My hands, calloused and cold, clutched the sack tighter, its rough texture a lifeline in a world of ruin. I had to get back, to Lotte, to Elsa, before the monster found me again. Chapter 10. The return journey to the cellar was a blur of heightened senses and desperate urgency. Each step, burdened by the small sack of potatoes, felt heavier than the last. The cold wind bit at my face, making my eyes water, blurring the already treacherous path through the rubble. The smell of dust and smoke was still thick in the air, but now, the earthy, familiar scent of the potatoes clinging to the sack was a small, comforting presence. My stomach, though still aching with hunger, felt a flicker of anticipation. My hands, rough and chapped, gripped the sack tightly, the cold, gritty skin of the potatoes a tangible promise. I squeezed back through the narrow opening into the cellar, greeted by a darkness that felt even more profound after the pale, desolate light of the street. The air in here was still, heavy with the damp, earthy smell of the underground, and a faint, sweet ghost of peach from yesterday. My eyes strained, trying to pierce the gloom. Lotte? Elsa? I whispered, my voice hoarse. A rustle, then Lotte's thin voice. Karl, you're back. Relief, fragile but potent, permeated her tone. Elsa stirred too, a soft sigh escaping her lips. I moved towards them, guided by their faint sounds. I could feel their small, cold bodies before I reached them, huddled together under the blankets. The cold in the cellar was as relentless as ever, seeping into my bones, making my teeth chatter. I sank down beside them, the cold, rough concrete chilling my knees, and immediately felt the warmth of their combined bodies, however meager, a small comfort against the pervasive chill. "Look what I found," I whispered, holding out the sack. The potatoes felt hard and cold in the thin cloth. Lotte's small hands reached out, brushing against the rough surface of the sack, her fingers closing around one of the potatoes. "Potatoes?" she breathed, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. Elsa, too, reached out, her green eyes, even in the near darkness, wide with a nascent hope. Raw potatoes, cold and hard, were not a feast, but they were food. We ate them slowly, meticulously, our teeth scraping against the cold, unyielding flesh. They tasted of earth and raw starch, a bitter contrast to the sweet peaches, but they were filling. Each mouthful was a conscious effort, a fight against the emptiness. The cold, unwashed skin of the potatoes felt rough against my tongue. The gritty texture of the outside mixed with the bland, dense interior. As we chewed, the only sounds were our soft, deliberate movements, punctuated by the distant muffled rumble of the city above, a low, constant growl that never truly faded. The cold seeped into our mouths with each bite, making our jaws ache. My cut hand throbbed, a dull, persistent beat. After we had eaten a few each, enough to dull the sharp edge of hunger, I carefully retied the sack. We needed to make them last. The darkness pressed in on us again, absolute and heavy. Lotte and Elsa nestled closer, their small, cold bodies seeking warmth. I wrapped my arms around them both, trying to provide what little heat I could. I could feel the rhythmic thrum of their hearts, fragile beats against the backdrop of the city's dying pulse. The familiar, musty smell of the cellar filled my nostrils. "Tell me a story, Karl," Lotte whispered, her voice barely audible in the dark. It was an old request, a routine from a time before, when Moody would tuck us into bed, and I would invent tales of brave knights and magical forests. The memory was a sharp, poignant ache in my chest. I closed my eyes, trying to conjure an image of something other than ruin and darkness. But my mind was filled with the gray light of the shattered street, the menacing shadows of the soldiers, the still hand of Elsa's mother, the monster. It was always there, lurking. "Once," I began, my voice a low, rough murmur, "there was a boy and his sister, and they lived in a very deep cave, and the cave was cold, but they had each other." The story felt thin, inadequate, stripped bare by the brutal reality of our lives. There were no knights, no magic, just the cold, the hunger, and the enduring presence of each other. "And a girl came to the cave," Elsa added softly, her small voice barely a whisper, echoing my words. "And she was cold too." "Yes," I affirmed, pulling them tighter. "And they shared what little they had, and they were safe in the cave. From the monster outside." The words were a balm, a fragile shield against the encroaching despair. It was not a story of heroics, but of survival, of small acts of kindness in a world that had forgotten such things. The cold continued to press in, the dampness clung to our clothes, and the distant rumble of the war was a constant, unsettling reminder. But for a few moments, huddled together in the absolute darkness, sharing the meager warmth of our bodies and the bitter taste of raw potatoes, we were safe. We were together. And that, in this monstrous, dying city, was everything. The rough brick against my back was still there, but now it felt less like a prison and more like a shelter. Chapter 11. The story, simple and stripped of all fantasy, faded into the oppressive darkness, leaving only the profound silence of the cellar, broken by our quiet breathing and the distant, ever-present growl of the city. Lotte and Elsa, lulled by the rhythm of my voice and the meager comfort of the potatoes, eventually succumbed to a fitful sleep, their small bodies a fragile weight against mine. I could feel the rise and fall of their chests, shallow and quick, and the damp chill of their clothes against my skin. The cold had become a permanent resident in my bones, an aching, dull companion. The scent of damp earth and stale air, tinged with the faint comforting smell of potatoes, filled the dark space. I stayed awake, vigilant, my mind a ceaseless churn of images and fears. I saw the crumbling facades of buildings, the twisted metal, the still, pale hand of Elsa's mother, the faces of the soldiers, harsh and indifferent, and always the monster, unseen but felt, its presence manifested in the constant rumble and distant explosions that vibrated through the earth beneath us. My stomach still ached, not with the sharp pangs of acute hunger, but with a dull, persistent emptiness. My cut hand throbbed, a steady pulse of discomfort. Hours passed, marked only by the gradual deepening of the cold and the subtle shifts in the symphony of distant destruction. The darkness was absolute, heavy and suffocating, making it impossible to discern the passage of time. My eyelids felt gritty, raw from lack of sleep and the ever-present dust. The rough brick against my back began to feel like a part of me, a permanent fixture of discomfort. Then, a new sound began to filter down to us. Not the familiar distant roar of bombers or the sharp crack of rifle fire, but something lower, more guttural, a continuous grinding rumble that vibrated through the very foundations of the cellar. It was closer, more immediate than anything we had heard before. It felt like the ground itself was groaning in agony. Lotte and Elsa stirred, whimpering, their fragile sleep broken by the intensifying vibrations. "What is that, Karl?" Lotte whispered, her voice laced with fresh terror, a thin tremor running through her small body. Elsa, too, was awake, her small hand clutching my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Her green eyes, wide and terrified, reflected the unseen monster in the darkness. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely audible, thick with dread. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic warning beat. The cold in the cellar seemed to sharpen, a sudden piercing chill that was not just from the air, but from the fear that gripped me. The musty air tasted of raw, unadulterated terror. The grinding rumble grew louder, accompanied now by a metallic screech and the heavy rhythmic clanking of something massive moving slowly, relentlessly above us. It wasn't just sounds from the sky anymore. It was on the ground. It was here. The vibrations intensified, making the dust rain down in thick clouds, filling the air with a gritty, choking sensation. I could feel the loose earth shifting beneath us. I pulled Lotte and Elsa closer, pressing them against me, trying to make myself a shield, however inadequate. My arms tightened around their small, fragile forms, my hands instinctively covering their heads. The stench of dust and pulverized earth became overwhelming, filling my nostrils, making my throat raw. Then, through the cacophony of grinding metal and earth-shaking rumbles, a new sound cut through, a sudden piercing crack that was impossibly loud, close, deafening. It was followed by a spray of what felt like grit and small stones hitting the plank door of our cellar. The wood groaned, splintered, and then, with a terrifying wrench, exploded inwards. A blinding raw light flooded the cellar, harsh and intrusive, momentarily paralyzing us. It was not the gentle light of dawn, but a brutal, artificial glare, cutting through the darkness like a surgeon's knife. The sudden change was disorienting, painful. My eyes, accustomed to the gloom, squeezed shut against the assault. The air rushed in, cold and biting, bringing with it the acrid smell of burnt fuel and something else, something metallic and sharp, like gun oil and scorched earth. The grinding noise outside was deafening now, a monstrous roar. When I dared to open my eyes again, blinking against the painful light, the scene before me was one of impossible, terrifying clarity. The plank door was gone, blasted inwards. In its place, a massive, dark shape filled the opening, its outline indistinct against the blinding light from outside. It was a tank, a monstrous metal beast, its cannon pointed directly at our cellar. The air was thick with smoke and dust, catching in my throat, making me cough. The sound of human voices, harsh and guttural, louder and closer than before, reached my ears. They were speaking a different language, alien and terrifying. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, began to descend the shattered steps towards us. My blood ran cold, colder than the cellar, colder than the deepest winter. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs, convinced this was the end. The monster had finally found us. And it had many heads, many voices, many cruel, unyielding forms. The rough brick against my back offered no comfort now, only a cold, hard finality. I pressed Lotte and Elsa closer, burying their faces against my chest, trying to shield them from the horror that was now flooding our last sanctuary. Chapter 12. The blinding light from the gaping maw where our cellar door had been was excruciating, searing into my dust-gritty eyes. It emanated from the outside, a stark, brutal contrast to the absolute darkness we'd known, and it illuminated the grotesque, looming shadow of the tank. It was like a monstrous metallic beast, its cannon a gaping maw, its presence filling the narrow opening, blotting out the sky. The air, now rushing in, was a frigid alien blend of burnt fuel, gun oil, and the sharp metallic tang of cold steel, mixing with the familiar damp earth and pulverized concrete. Each breath scraped in my throat. The heavy rhythmic clanking and grinding of the tank's treads outside was deafening, a relentless earth-shaking rumble that made my teeth ache. But closer, more immediate, were the heavy, deliberate footsteps descending the shattered stairs. My heart hammered, a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. I buried Lotte and Elsa deeper into my chest, their small, trembling bodies pressed against my own, trying to shield them from the inevitable, from the monster that had finally breached our last sanctuary. Their small hands clutched my threadbare coat with desperate, surprising strength. Two figures materialized in the harsh light, descending into the cellar. They were massive, hulking shapes, draped in unfamiliar dark uniforms. Their helmets, round and strange, glinted in the light. Their faces were obscured by shadow and grime, but their eyes, when they swept over us, were sharp, cold, and utterly devoid of warmth. Their language was guttural, harsh, completely alien. It was the language of the invaders, the monster itself. One of them carried a rifle, held loosely but ready, its barrel a dark, menacing hole. The other held a flashlight, a powerful beam that cut through the remaining cellar gloom, scanning every corner, every shadow, making our hiding place feel utterly exposed, vulnerable. The beam lingered on us, two children and a boy, huddled together like cornered animals. The light was physically painful, burning into my retinas. I instinctively flinched, pulling my head down, trying to make myself smaller. They barked something, a series of sharp, unintelligible commands. My mind was numb with terror. I didn't understand, but the tone, the coldness in their voices needed no translation. They were demanding something. A boot, heavy and scuffed, nudged my leg. The rough leather scraped against my trousers, and the cold metal of a buckle pressed against my skin. It was a physical jolt, forcing me to look up. The soldier stood over us, a towering, menacing silhouette. The smell of his uniform, unwashed wool, sweat, and gunpowder, was overpowering. His face, now closer, was grim, unshaven, his eyes like chips of ice. He pointed at us, then gestured roughly towards the cellar opening. His words were harsh, insistent. They wanted us out. Lotte whimpered, burrowing deeper into my chest. Elsa, however, slowly lifted her head, her wide green eyes fixed on the soldier. There was no fear in her gaze now, only a profound, exhausted emptiness. Her small hand, still clutching her headless doll, tightened around my arm. "Come," I whispered to them, my voice barely audible, raw with fear and a profound sense of defeat. "We have to go." My legs felt like lead, unwilling to obey, but the soldiers continued urging. A sharp, impatient growl propelled me. Slowly, stiffly, I began to uncurl myself, untangling my limbs from Lotte and Elsa. The cold, unyielding brick against my back felt like a final, cold farewell to the only safety we had known. Every muscle in my body protested, screaming with fatigue and fear. I helped Lotte and Elsa to their feet, their small bodies unsteady. We began the slow, agonizing ascent out of the cellar, up the shattered steps. Each step crunched on splintered wood and loose debris. The grinding rumble of the tank outside grew louder with every upward movement, threatening to shatter my eardrums. The air became sharper, colder, laden with the acrid stench of war, burnt metal, cordite, dust. My hands, rough and aching, instinctively reached out to steady myself on the broken masonry. When we emerged into the desolate street, the full force of the winter morning hit us. It was a gray, overcast sky, heavy and oppressive, reflecting the bleakness of the ruined city. The air was frigid, biting at our exposed skin, making us shiver uncontrollably. The wind whipped around us, carrying a constant spray of fine grit and dust. The tank was even larger, more terrifying than I had imagined. It squatted in the middle of our ruined street, A hulking, dark green monster, its gun barrel still pointed at our former cellar. Other soldiers, also in the unfamiliar dark uniforms, were moving among the ruins, their forms grim and purposeful. The sounds of their harsh language, mixed with the ongoing rumble of other vehicles, filled the air. The smell of exhaust fumes and gunpowder was thick, suffocating. My eyes swept over the street, once familiar, now utterly alien. Everything was gone. Our home, Frau Schmidt's bakery, the corner where Mutti used to buy our bread, all reduced to mountains of rubble, twisted metal, and splintered wood. The sight was a final, crushing blow, a visual representation of the emptiness inside me. The cold, broken pavement felt sharp and unforgiving beneath my worn boots. The soldier who had found us gestured again, a harsh, sweeping motion indicating a direction. We were to go. Where, I didn't know. But there was no choice. With Lotte clinging to one hand and Elsa to the other, their small, cold hands anchors in the storm, I began to walk. Each step was a step into the unknown, away from the only place that had offered us even the illusion of safety, into the monstrous alien world that had swallowed our lives whole. The cold, hard ground beneath our feet was a stark reminder that everything we had known, everything we had been, was now irrevocably lost. The gritty dust on my tongue felt like the taste of pure defeat. Chapter 13. The march was less a walk and more a staggered shuffle through a nightmare rendered in shades of gray and ochre. The ground beneath our worn boots was a relentless obstacle course of broken paving stones, twisted metal, and shattered glass. Each step a perilous decision. The cold, raw wind never ceased, tearing at our thin clothes, raising goosebumps on our exposed skin, and carrying a constant, biting spray of dust and fine debris that stung our eyes and clung to our dry lips. My cut hand throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but the pain was distant, overshadowed by the overwhelming exhaustion and fear. We were part of a growing stream of people, a slow, silent river of humanity, emerging from cellars and ruins prodded by the soldiers. Their uniforms were a darker green now that we were in the open, and the red star insignias on their helmets were stark against the gray. Their language, harsh and commanding, seemed to echo from every direction, bouncing off the skeletal remains of buildings. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, the acrid scent of burnt wood and concrete, mingled with the metallic tang of fear and the subtle cloying sweetness of distant decay. Lotte clung to my left hand, her small body shivering violently, her head bowed against the wind. Elsa, on my right, was strangely silent, her grip surprisingly strong, her wide green eyes fixed straight ahead, seeing but not seeing, as if retreating deep within herself. Her small, headless doll was clutched tightly to her chest. Their small, cold hands were my only anchors in the swirling chaos. The sounds of the city were a cacophony of destruction, the ceaseless rumble of tanks and trucks, the shouted commands of soldiers, the distant crackle of small arms fire, and occasionally the sharp concussive boom of artillery. Each explosion sent a tremor through the ground, a physical reminder of the monster's relentless advance. My ears ached from the constant din, and my head pounded with a dull, persistent ache. We passed scenes that would forever be etched into the dark corners of my memory. A tram car, overturned and charred, its wheels twisted skyward like accusing fingers. A proud fountain, now a pile of broken marble, its basin filled not with water, but with stagnant, icy debris. The facade of a grand building cleaved open like a dollhouse, revealing intimate glimpses of lives abruptly ended. A child's bed, a broken teacup on a table, a coat still hanging on a hook. The cold wind whistled through these gaping wounds, carrying with it the ghost of a former life. A particularly strong gust of wind swept down a narrow alley, carrying a flurry of ash and debris that tasted like pulverized bone and despair. It was then that I saw her. A woman, old and thin, collapsed by the side of the road, her eyes staring blankly at the gray sky. She clutched a small, leather-bound book to her chest. No one stopped for her. The river of people simply flowed around her, a silent, grim tide. The soldiers, too, ignored her, their attention fixed on the living. The cold, rough texture of the rubble beneath my boots felt indifferent to her plight. My stomach, though momentarily dulled by the raw potatoes, began its insidious gnawing again, a hollow emptiness that spread through my entire being. My throat was parched, raw from the dust and cold. I searched desperately for any sign of water, but all I saw were burst pipes, gushing icy streams onto the already sodden earth, freezing quickly into treacherous sheets of ice. We were led to a large square, once bustling with life, now a vast open expanse of mud and churned earth, surrounded by more ruined buildings. Tanks were parked haphazardly, their metallic bodies dark and imposing. Soldiers were everywhere, directing people, separating families. My heart leaped into my throat. Separation. The ultimate fear. I tightened my grip on Lotte and Elsa, pulling them closer, pressing their small bodies against my sides as if to weld us into one unbreakable unit. I could feel the clammy cold of their skin through their clothes and the rapid thrum of their fear-stricken hearts. The cold wind in the open square was even more brutal, whipping around us, making our eyes water uncontrollably. The air here was thick with the smell of exhaust, damp earth, and an even stronger, more unsettling stench of unwashed bodies and fear. A soldier, larger than the others, his face grim and scarred, barked something, pointing with his rifle. He gestured towards a cluster of women and younger children on one side of the square. Then he pointed at me, then at another group of older boys and men. My blood ran cold. He wanted to separate us. Lotte began to cry, a small, choked sob that tore at my heart. Elsa, still silent, looked up at me, her green eyes wide and filled with a sudden, profound panic. Her small fingers dug into my hand. "No," I whispered, the word raw, desperate, barely audible amidst the din of the square. I shook my head, my jaw clenched. I wouldn't let them. They were all I had left. The rough, unyielding ground beneath my feet felt like a trap, sealing our fate. The cold, unblinking eyes of the soldier bore into me, and I knew with a terrifying certainty that my small, futile resistance would mean nothing. Chapter 14. The soldier's cold, unblinking eyes bore into me, cutting through the thin veil of my defiance. His face, scarred and grim, was a mask of indifference. He barked something again, his voice like a whip crack, and took a step closer, raising his rifle slightly. The cold, black barrel glinted in the dull light, a stark and undeniable threat. My small, desperate no was swallowed by the overwhelming din of the square, the rumble of tanks, the shouts of soldiers, the mournful creak of distant ruins. The bitter taste of pure helplessness filled my mouth. Lotte's cries intensified, small, broken sounds that tore at my chest. She buried her face against my leg, her thin body shaking uncontrollably. Elsa, however, remained eerily silent, her wide green eyes fixed on the soldier's face, a profound emptiness in their depths. Her small fingers, cold and rigid, dug into my palm, her grip a silent plea. I could feel the clammy sweat on her skin through her thin clothes. The soldier made another sharp gesture, this time with the rifle itself, pointing it directly at the group of women and younger children. He then pointed to me, then to the group of older boys and men. There was no misunderstanding, no argument, no choice. The cold wind howled around us, whipping up more dust and debris, a physical manifestation of the chaos. The biting cold seeped into my bones, magnifying the ache of dread. A new figure approached, another soldier, older, his face etched with weariness, but with the same cold, unyielding authority. He spoke to the first soldier in their harsh, guttural language, then turned to us. His gaze, less overtly menacing, still held no warmth, only a weary practicality. He pointed to Lotte and Elsa, then to the women's group, then to me, then to the men. The message was clear, final. My vision blurred. The chaos of the square, the dark uniforms, the ruined buildings, all swam before my eyes. All I could see was Lotte's tear-streaked face and Elsa's hollow, silent stare. The monster was not just bombs and tanks. It was the cold, unfeeling bureaucracy of war, the casual cruelty of separation. "Lotte," I choked out, my voice raw, breaking. I knelt, pulling her tightly to me, burying my face in her cold, dusty hair. It smelled of earth and fear. "Listen to me. You must stay with Elsa. You must. Do you understand?" I pulled back, looking into her terrified eyes. "We protect her, always." Lotte just sobbed, her small hands clutching my coat. I turned to Elsa, taking her small, cold face in my trembling hands. Her skin was rough, chapped. "Elsa," I said, trying to infuse my voice with all the courage I could muster, "you stay with Lotte. Never let go of her. I will find you, I promise." The lie tasted like ash in my mouth, but it was all I could give her. Her green eyes, filled with an ancient sorrow, seemed to understand. She nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, her grip on her headless doll tightening. The rough wooden surface of the doll seemed to offer her some small comfort. The soldier nudged me again, more insistently this time, his rifle tapping my shoulder. Time was running out. With a final desperate hug, I released Lotte, placing her small hand firmly into Elsa's. "Hold hands," I commanded, my voice hoarse. "Always." Their small figures, two bundles of fear and vulnerability, began to be ushered away, pushed gently but firmly by another soldier towards the group of women and younger children. Lotte looked back once, her face a blur of tears and confusion, her hand still reaching for me. Elsa just walked, a small, silent ghost, her eyes fixed forward, her grip on Lotte's hand unwavering. I watched them go, my heart tearing in my chest, a physical pain that stole my breath. Each receding step they took was a step further into the monstrous unknown, further away from the last vestiges of my family. The cold wind seemed to whip around me with renewed ferocity, and the fine grit stinging my eyes felt like my own unshed tears. The pungent smell of exhaust fumes and the metallic scent of war filled my nostrils, suffocating me. Then, a harsh shove from the soldier propelled me forward, away from them, towards the group of older boys and men. My legs felt like lead, unwilling to move, but I was forced along, a small piece of debris in the relentless current of war. I kept my eyes on Lotte and Elsa until their small forms were swallowed by the crowd, until they were just two more indistinguishable specks in the gray, desolate landscape. The sound of their fading whimpers echoed in my mind, a tormenting symphony. The cold on my now empty hands was sudden, sharp, and absolute. The world had gone utterly bleak. The sky above, a flat, oppressive gray, mirrored the despair in my heart. The rough, churned earth beneath my boots felt like the end of everything. I was alone now, truly alone, swallowed by the monster that was Berlin in its final agonizing throes. My throat was raw, my eyes burning, and the cold that enveloped me was no longer just from the air, but from the terrifying, gaping void where my family had been. Chapter 15. The separation was a wound, fresh and bleeding, tearing a gaping hole in the fabric of my being. The cold on my hands, where Lotte's and Elsa's small, trembling fingers had just been, was a phantom ache, sharper and more profound than any physical pain. I was pushed into the jostling crowd of older boys and men, a silent, grim mass. The air here was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and the pervasive, acrid scent of gunpowder and burnt debris. The cold wind continued its relentless assault, making my skin prickle and my eyes water, blurring the already desolate landscape. I tried to turn, to catch one last glimpse of Lotte and Elsa, but the press of bodies and the stern shoves of the soldiers kept me moving forward, always forward. My throat was raw, choked with unshed tears, and a deep guttural sob was trapped in my chest, desperate to escape. The image of Lotte's tear-streaked face and Elsa's silent, empty gaze burned behind my eyelids, a tormenting, indelible brand. The monster of war had not just taken our home, our food, our safety. It had taken my family, severing the last fragile threads that bound me to a life before. The monstrous rumble of tanks, the harsh commands of the soldiers, the distant crackle of rifle fire. It was all just background noise now, a meaningless cacophony. The true noise was the agonizing silence in my heart, the echoing void where their laughter, their fear, their simple presence had been. The cold ground beneath my feet felt utterly devoid of hope. We were marched through streets I barely recognized, past buildings that were little more than shattered husks, their interiors exposed to the elements like open wounds. The sky remained an oppressive, unbroken gray, matching the despair that weighed down on me. I walked in a daze, my body moving on its own, a puppet without strings, my senses dulled by the crushing weight of loss. The rough texture of the rubble beneath my boots was a constant, dull abrasion, but I felt nothing. Days blurred into a monotonous, agonizing cycle of cold, hunger, and bone-deep fatigue. We were held in makeshift camps, sprawling collections of tents and temporary shelters in bombed-out parks, surrounded by the constant movement of soldiers and vehicles. The food was meager: thin, watery soup, a piece of dry bread, barely enough to keep the gnawing hunger at bay. The cold never truly left, seeping into our clothes, into our skin, into our very marrow, making sleep a fitful, shivering agony. The air in these camps was thick with the smell of hundreds of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and the ever-present stench of wood smoke and distant fires. My thoughts were a constant, desperate search for Lotte and Elsa. I scanned every face, every small figure in the crowded, muddy encampments. Every child's cry made my heart leap. Every flash of bright color in the dreary landscape sent a jolt of false hope through me. I concocted desperate plans to escape, to retrace my steps, to find the women's camp, to search every cellar and every ruined street. But the presence of the soldiers, their rifles, their watchful eyes, was a constant, insurmountable barrier. The mud beneath my worn boots was a cold, sucking presence, pulling me deeper into the grim reality. The monster had not only devoured the city, but it had eaten away at something inside me. The boy who had once told stories of brave knights, who had clung to Moody's skirt, was gone. In his place was a shell, driven only by the faint, desperate whisper of a promise. I will find you. It was a promise I didn't know how to keep, a light flickering in an overwhelming darkness, constantly threatened by the cold wind of despair. One evening, as the last vestiges of pale, watery light faded from the sky, and the cold settled with its familiar, oppressive weight, I sat huddled against a flimsy tent wall. The ground was frozen solid, and the cold seeped through the thin canvas, chilling me to the bone. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning wood from a small, communal fire, a distant, mocking warmth. I closed my eyes, trying once more to conjure Moody's face, but it was Lotte's and Elsa's faces that appeared, clear and heartbreakingly vivid. Lotte's fearful eyes, Elsa's silent green gaze, and the memory of their small, cold hands in mine. The cold on my hands was still there, sharp and aching. A single, hot tear, the first in what felt like an eternity, finally escaped my eye, tracing a path through the grime on my cheek. It was a searing, physical sensation, a release of the immense pressure that had built within me, the taste of salt mixed with the dust on my lips. The war, the fall of Berlin, had been a monstrous consuming fire. It had burned away everything I knew, everything I loved, leaving behind only ash and ruin. But in that ash, in that profound emptiness, a tiny ember of something remained, the memory of two small girls, the weight of a promise, and the unyielding, though now silent, beat of a heart that refused to stop searching. I was Karl, a boy forged in the crucible of absolute loss, adrift in the wreckage of a broken world. The cold, unfeeling ground beneath me was the only constant, a stark reminder of the new, desolate reality. The noise of the distant fighting, the ceaseless rumble, was no longer just the monster, but the soundtrack to my unending search.